2 men, 1 private room, 2 hours. And when they walked out, the most dangerous war the world had seen in decades suddenly had a path forward. Here's everything the headlines missed. On April 15th, 2026, Pakistan's Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, flew into Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, carrying something no world leader had successfully carried in months. A real shot at stopping this war before it consumed the entire Middle East. He was going to meet Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And what happened inside that palace over the next 2 hours did not just move diplomacy forward. It may have pulled the world back from the very edge of something irreversible. But to understand why that meeting mattered so much, you first need to understand what was already on fire when Sharif walked through that door. Go back to February 28th, 2026. The United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated military strike that killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, destroyed nuclear sites, and hit military infrastructure across the entire country. Iran did not stay quiet. Within hours, missiles and drones were flying at Israel, at American military bases, and at Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, all of them targeted for hosting American forces on their soil. And then Iran did something that sent shockwaves through every economy on the planet. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. The International Energy Agency called it the largest oil supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Larger than 1,973, larger than the Iranian Revolution. Over 230 fully loaded oil tankers sat anchored in the Gulf, going nowhere. The world's most critical shipping lane, completely shut. Saudi Arabia was now living a nightmare. Iranian weapons landing on its soil. Its oil trapped behind a closed strait. Hundreds of incoming missiles being intercepted or exploding across Saudi infrastructure. The Crown Prince looked at all of this with cold clarity. Every single day this war continued was a day Saudi oil could not reach buyers. A day Iranian missiles could hit Saudi refineries. A day his entire Vision 2030 plan, the foreign investment, the economic transformation, everything was bleeding out. He needed this war to end. And he had one specific tool that nobody else in the room had, Pakistan. The relationship between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia is one of the most important strategic partnerships most people have never heard of. Pakistani troops have been stationed in Saudi Arabia since the 1960s. Pakistan has trained between 8,000 and 10,000 Saudi military personnel. Saudi Arabia has repeatedly rescued Pakistan from economic collapse with enormous financial transfers. But in September 2025, everything was formalized at a completely new level. At Al Yamama Palace in Riyadh, the exact same palace complex where this April meeting would later take place, the Crown Prince and Prime Minister Sharif signed the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement. It was the first military pact between an Arab Gulf state and a nuclear-armed nation. The language was unambiguous. Any aggression against one country would be treated as aggression against both. Analysts at Harvard's Belfer Center said it created a new security architecture across the Middle East. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War said Iran would be watching this very closely, and they were right to watch it. The nuclear dimension of the pact was left deliberately vague. Pakistan's defense minister initially suggested it covered nuclear sharing before walking that back. A senior Saudi official told Reuters that the agreement covered all military means without being specific. The ambiguity was the message. When Operation Epic Fury began and Iran started hitting Saudi territory, the pact became operational within days. Pakistani Air Force jets and support aircraft began arriving at King Abdulaziz Air Base in Saudi Arabia's eastern province. The announcement came on April 11, 2026. The exact same day Pakistan was hosting the most sensitive American-Iranian peace talks since 1979. That timing was not an accident. Here's where Pakistan's story becomes something foreign policy analysts say almost never works in practice. Islamabad was simultaneously the neutral mediator trying to bring Washington and Tehran to a deal, and the treaty-bound military ally of the country, Iran, had been bombing. A former 3-star Pakistani general described the situation plainly. Pakistan could hold both roles only if the military deployment stayed strictly defensive, time-limited, and completely transparent. The moment it looked offensive, he said, the entire dual role collapses, and Iran's perception, not Pakistan's intent, would decide whether trust survived, and yet Iran showed up. A 70-member Iranian delegation led by Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf flew to Islamabad. They sat across a table from 300 American officials led by Vice President J.D. Vance for 21 hours straight. That single fact says everything about how much credibility Pakistan had built. Even after the world learned about Pakistani jets deployed to Saudi Arabia, Iran stayed in the room. That does not happen unless trust runs very deep. Those 21 hours produced no agreement. The gaps were enormous. America wanted the end of Iran's nuclear program, missile restrictions, the permanent reopening of the strait, and limits on Iranian-backed armed groups. Iran came back with demands for an end to all strikes, security guarantees, war reparations, and most provocative of all, international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. Two positions that were structurally incompatible. The talks collapsed. America imposed a full naval blockade of Iranian ports within 24 hours. The cost to Iran, $400 million every single day. The channel was broken. This is the moment the Jeddah meeting becomes everything. Sharif walked into Al Yamama Palace, carrying the wreckage of those 21 hours. Every gap, every red line, every demand both sides had made. He laid it all out for the Crown Prince. The nuclear enrichment gap, the Hormuz sovereignty question, Iran's demand for war reparations, the blockade squeezing Iran's economy to the bone, and Iran's counter-threat. If America would not lift the blockade, Tehran would shut down the Persian Gulf, the Sea of Oman, and the Red Sea entirely. For Saudi Arabia, that threat was not abstract. It was a direct economic death sentence. The Crown Prince listened, and then he put something on the table that Pakistan alone could not offer. Saudi Arabia has a back channel to the White House that bypasses every formal diplomatic layer. The Crown Prince's relationship with President Trump is personal, documented, and direct. When he has something to say to Trump, it does not travel through the State Department. It goes straight. And on that same day, Saudi Arabia did something else. Pakistan's finance ministry announced a new $3 billion Saudi loan commitment to shore up Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves on top of an existing $5 billion Saudi deposit that Saudi Arabia simultaneously agreed to extend under more favorable terms. That was not charity. That was a strategic transaction. A Pakistan under financial pressure is a Pakistan that faces constant domestic political calls to pull back from expensive international commitments. A Pakistan with $8 billion in Saudi financial backing is a Pakistan that can stay in this fight for as long as the peace process needs it. The Crown Prince was not just discussing peace. He was paying for the conditions that make peace possible. While Sharif was inside the palace, something else was happening on the other side of the region. Pakistan's army chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, landed in Tehran. No announcement. No press conference. The visit emerged from leaks and the tracking of his movements. Pakistani officials described him as carrying a new message from Washington, seeking to narrow the gaps between the two sides. The Prime Minister in Jeddah with the Saudi Crown Prince. The army chief in Tehran with Iranian leadership. Simultaneously. That is not coincidence. That is a coordinated diplomatic operation, running on two tracks at exactly the same time. The downstream effect of that double move became visible within hours. President Trump told reporters the Iran war was very close to being over. He praised Pakistan's army chief as doing a great job. He said talks could resume within days in Islamabad. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said it was highly probable that ceasefire talks would restart. Vice President Vance, who had walked out of Islamabad saying no deal had been reached, told an audience in Georgia that he felt very good about where things stood on peace talks. The diplomatic temperature shifted measurably within hours of the Jeddah meeting. That is the fingerprint of a conversation that actually moved something. Sharif's movement did not stop in Jeddah. He flew to Doha, where he met Qatar's Emir Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. Qatar supplies 12 to 14% of Europe's liquefied natural gas through the Strait of Hormuz, meaning it had been one of the most economically damaged countries in the entire conflict without firing a single shot. The Emir fed Qatar's assessment of a workable Hormuz arrangement into the mediation alongside Saudi Arabia's. Then Sharif flew to Antalya, Turkey for the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, where he met President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Turkey had been positioning itself as a neutral broker, criticizing Israeli military actions, maintaining back channels to both Tehran and Washington. Erdogan's message to both sides was direct. There is no negotiating with clenched fists. Another strand added to the scaffolding. And then came a detail that made the entire timeline even more urgent. CNN reported, confirmed by multiple sources, that China was planning to deliver new air defense weaponry to Iran in the coming weeks. Systems specifically designed to shoot down American and Israeli aircraft. President Trump responded directly, if China does that, China is going to have big problems. The Crown Prince understood what that meant. Sharif understood what that meant. Everyone in that palace room understood what it meant. Any deal reached before those Chinese systems arrived would be negotiated under a completely different balance of power than a deal attempted after delivery. The clock on diplomacy was not just the ceasefire expiration date. It was also a weapons delivery schedule. The mediators were now working three specific problems. The nuclear question. America wanted a 20-year enrichment suspension. Iran offered 3 to 5 years. That gap does not close with clever wording. It needs either a fundamental shift or creative sequencing that lets both sides claim a domestic win. The Hormuz question. Iran wants recognized authority over the strait, including the right to charge tolls. America wants free passage guaranteed permanently. Those positions need a bridging formula that does not yet exist on paper. And the reparations question, Iran needs to be seen pursuing compensation for the destruction caused by American and Israeli strikes. America cannot politically agree to call it reparations. The likely solution, a reconstruction fund framed as voluntary Gulf state contributions with financial flows that work economically like reparations without being legally labeled as such. These formulas do not get invented in front of cameras. They get invented in private rooms between leaders who trust each other enough to say what they actually think. Pakistan's balancing act carried its own extraordinary weight. Between 10 and 20% of Pakistan's 230 million people are Shia Muslim. Any Pakistani government seen as helping destroy Iran faces serious domestic consequences, politically, socially, and in terms of radicalization risk. Pakistan also shares a direct border with Iran. Islamabad was threading all of this simultaneously. Military partner to Saudi Arabia, neutral mediator between Washington and Tehran, economic dependent of both Riyadh and the International Monetary Fund, and domestic political actor that could not be seen as an American proxy against a Muslim nation. The tightrope was holding because Pakistan's entire senior leadership was operating as a single coordinated machine. The army chief personally spoke to President Trump by phone. The prime minister called Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. The deputy prime minister held separate calls with Iran's foreign minister and Turkey's foreign minister, every relationship being worked simultaneously, feeding into one common strategic picture. The war had killed more than 4,000 people across the Middle East. It had destroyed Iranian nuclear sites, killed the supreme leader, damaged refineries across the Gulf, and closed the world's most critical maritime lane for nearly 7 weeks. Iran's currency had lost 15% of its value. 158 million barrels of Iranian oil were stranded at sea on tankers that could not reach buyers. Iran's new supreme leader was caught between hardliners, broadcasting on state television that Iran had the upper hand, and an economy in accelerating freefall. Iran's parliament speaker had told President Trump directly, "If you fight, we will fight." Iran's foreign minister was simultaneously calling Berlin, Paris, and London. Tehran was reaching in two directions at once, toward confrontation and toward resolution. Outside mediators cannot decide which one wins inside Iran, but they can change the conditions that make resolution more attractive than continued fighting. That is exactly what the Jeddah meeting was designed to do. Before April 15th, the Islamabad talks had collapsed. The blockade was running. Iran was threatening to close 3 bodies of water. The ceasefire was hanging by a thread. The diplomatic channel was, in practical terms, dead. After 2 hours between the Crown Prince and Sharif, after the $3 billion Saudi commitment to Pakistan's reserves, after the army chief flew into Tehran with a new message, after the president said the war was very close to being over, the channel reopened. Not with guarantees, not cleanly, but it reopened. That is what real diplomacy looks like when the cameras are off. No missiles, no press releases, no choreographed handshakes. 2 men in a room, talking honestly, finding the angle that makes incompatible positions just compatible enough to keep people alive. The Islamabad process is not over. Round 2 is coming. And what happens in that room next may determine whether the Middle East gets a ceasefire or something far worse.